What do you love?
I love poetry, and a glass of scotch, and of course, my friend Baxter here.
Well, guess what? Now this is happening.
Excuse me. Excuse me. What are you doing?
That's how I roll.
So imagine that being a conversation between me and the Birdman, the scratching method. You scratch a liberal and you see how they cry. If they shed tears that are ultimately fascist, if they bleed blood, is it fascist? If they take revenge, what for? If they turn their back, what for? The idea is to expose bad actors.
But kind people find that they are cruel. Brave men discover that they are really cowards. Confronted with their true selves, most men run away screaming.
So, yeah, this scene highlights something important regarding centrists who are self-righteous to a self-deceiving degree. And this will become relevant when we re-examine what I wrote in response to the Birdman acting in bad faith towards me, which is to say that they're basically a black Gandalf. Or in this case, they're a black Gandalf, someone self-righteous wearing the ring, taking the soup, what have you, who, as a house servant, punches down against whistleblowers of J.K. Rowling. Hi everyone, I just released my 7th book, The Practice Volume is Live, if you'd like to hear or read more about that, and it features a variety of cool people such as Maddie Minx, who I've worked with. Very proud of it, go and check it out. However, that isn't the point of today's video. Rather, the point of today's video is to respond to someone who's back for more defending themselves despite the fact that we have criticized them, and when in fact they have acknowledged our criticisms in bad faith. Ta-da! The Birdman, insisting that they are not a grifter, exposing the grift, the word grifter and what it means. People keep saying we are misusing the word grifter. Well, let's see about that. This is an upload, and I respond, moderates can grift too. They're called Tolkiens. And as far as that goes, this is basically what we'll be unpacking today. And we will be revisiting some various points that we've covered already in this video here. Essay 10 2.5, Don't Tag Me or the Birdman Shows His Ass. So in this video, I had followed up my initial response to the Birdman, or rather, my response to the Birdman responding to me, where he was saying, don't tag me or else, basically, and a veiled threat, if you will. Hence the title, Don't Tag Me or the Birdman Shows His Ass. So this was, the Birdman had initially responded to me, and what I was saying about them in a larger essay, where before writing that essay, I had responded to them in good faith, no response from them. So I went on to critique J.K. Rowling and mentioned the Birdman more as a side note, given I had already sort of unpacked what I felt about them, only for them to say, stop tagging me in your videos about J.K. Rowling, someone that the Birdman clearly endorses. Which led me, after releasing my initial essay about J.K. Rowling, to have a follow-up with the Birdman where I face them directly and say to them, realizing that they're a bad actor, hey, you're showing your ass to me. If you scratch a liberal, a fascist bleeds. Because anyone who defends J.K. Rowling and her work as uncritically as the Birdman does is fascist. They're a grifter of a particular sort, not an open reactionary per se, but a liberal, specifically a token liberal. And that is something that I want to continue addressing today with a follow-up to a follow-up. So keeping that in mind, there are a couple of things that we'll have to unpack. So I have a list of different things here to look at, and then what I'll do after I've gone through those is I will read an expanded section from my essay where I talk about the idea of tokenism and the token grifter which is two sides of the same coin. Liberalism and fascism under capital, and capitalist realism. Insofar as liberals don't believe in anything except capital and its values, its deeply unequal values, mind you, dressed up in the language of liberty, but also of commerce. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, John Locke. And token actors, black or otherwise, essentially amount to servants in the house who defend the house from people who blow the whistle. And that is unto itself a very particular kind of grift, a grift that is more centrist, more moderate reasoned. And this was something that I pointed out initially regarding the Birdman, where I said Martin Luther King, in a letter from Birmingham jail in 1963, cautioned against the white moderate. But the same idea applies to token moderates, moderates of color who can sell out in a very particular form of grift that isn't always openly reactionary. Point in fact, it is oftentimes dressed in the language of punching up in ways that also punch down. And if you punch down in a centrist kind of way, it centralizes things and keeps them from moving in any discernible direction. It maintains the status quo, e.g. Obama, e.g. Farrakhan, and a variety of other people as well that you see not just in the past, but also in more recent examples of popular media. An example that leaps to mind in terms of token characters in the evangelical circuit is O Father from The Boys, who is essentially a false preacher tied to the megachurch that is, in the show's writing, foisted off onto a preacher of color, is based off, I would imagine, real-life sellouts. That, however imperfectly the show does it, it does raise an interesting point, which is that people of color can sell out, and they sell out in the usual venues. For every Martin Luther King, you would have a Farrakhan, though in the case of Farrakhan, they belong to the Nation of Islam, but they also allegedly had a hand in the assassination of Malcolm X. In this case, this person of color, this token sellout, is of a more reactionary sort, but they have that liberal side of things where they don't stand for anything except for money. So again, two sides of the same coin. It's the reactionary side and the moderate side. So for every "Oh Father" that you have, you can just as easily have a Birdman. You can have an Obama versus someone like Candace Owens. And a grift is a grift. It's just how you go about it. You can be more centrist, you can be more moderate, more reasoned, or you can be more reactionary. And those who are more reactionary tend to use insults in a way that is reactionary, whereas moderates tend to give left-handed compliments or veiled threats, the way that the Birdman did towards me, which I'll reiterate towards the end of the video. With any token, moderate or otherwise, there is a particular method that I argue for to expose them. You don't expose them through the free marketplace of ideas per se. It's more a performance where they out themselves in ways that are less about the arguments of persuasion and more the argument of them responding to you in a way that betrays who they really are. If you're dealing with a bad actor, they use, generally speaking, the same language that you do. Liberals use the language of inclusion and freedom in defense of capital, re. the Birdman and Harry Potter. So the best way to expose them isn't by treating them as a good actor, because they're not a good actor. And in the case of the Birdman, I did treat them in good faith initially, but they exposed themselves in bad faith, making me realize that I have to use a different method, something I call the scratching method or reversing abjection, or I present something to them that they don't want to face, and they, unable to deal with that, find it easier through what I call mirror syndrome to punch the person holding the mirror, to attack the whistleblower, if you will. And this will be presented in the language of reason, the way that all moderates do, the way that centrists do. And it doesn't just occur with white, straight, male centrists, but also any token under the sun. So if you need a basic idea of what I'm talking about, the abjection process itself comes from Julia Kristeva's The Powers of Horror, meaning to throw off, abject, to throw off into a state of abnormality. It's essentially us versus them, but it tends to be reiterated through the language of the alien, specifically a fetishized alien. The alien from Alien, the xenomorph, is a classic example of that. But in a more general sense, it boils down to a black mirror, e.g. The Twilight Zone with Rod Serling, a show which unto itself had a socially active character that it would achieve consciously in a very woke way for the time in regards to the allegory that it would try and convey through the show's maker, who had ties to social activism in the 1950s and 60s. The Black Mirror is something that you show to expose the things that society would rather not face in polite discourse, but rather through the stories of fantasy, of science fiction, of Gothic, is summed up nicely in this specific scene, the Magic Mirror Gate from The Never-Ending Story.
Trejo has to face his true self.
So what? That won't be too hard for him.
Oh, that's what everyone thinks. But kind people find that they are cruel. Brave men discover that they are really cowards. Confronted with their true selves, most men run away screaming.
So, yeah, this scene highlights something important regarding centrists who are self-righteous to a self-deceiving degree. And this will become relevant when we re-examine what I wrote in response to the Birdman acting in bad faith towards me, which is to say that they're basically a black Gandalf. Or in this case, they're a black Gandalf, someone self-righteous wearing the ring, taking the soup, what have you, who, as a house servant, punches down against whistleblowers of J.K. Rowling. But this same basic idea also applies to other forms of media, personalities, geopolitics, current events, what have you, that we can critique in kind. So reversing the abjection process is to reverse state predation in ways that force people who defend that system, who lie to themselves, to take the red pill for all intents and purposes, to show them on Plato's cave wall shadows on a black mirror that break the spell as opposed to upholding it. So it's a subversion of Plato's allegory of the cave, but it's the same basic idea. Milton called it darkness visible. Jonathan Swift called it splendid mendax. It is not new, and it can be used through the Trojan horse, which was created by Athena, goddess of wisdom, to storm Troy as being a dualistic metaphor, either upholding capital or tearing capital down. We all use the same language, the same metaphors, allegories. Function is determined by where power flows. So by scratching a centrist, a fascist will bleed, which happens with someone like the Birdman, who, when scratched, copes hard and doubles down, denying that they are a grifter and trying to remind people through a reasoned argument that they are not a grifter because, according to them, grifter has a very specific definition. And I'm going to make the definition a little bit broader because words are like that. You can redefine them to suit a specific agenda. In my case, we're exposing grifters, not just of a reactionary sort, but also a moderate sort, token, in the Birdman's case. Before we turn the magic mirror once more upon the Birdman, we also want to bear in mind the same basic criticisms we have can be applied towards other token people as well, and the same principles and desired effect are at work and something that we push towards. So, for instance, when I'm criticizing token people, I'm not doing it through slurs, but rather, as Martin Luther King would say, through the quality of their character, of their argument, of their position and what it stands for. What do liberals stand for? What are they defending through their words? However pretty or reasoned they are, however inclusive they seem on their face, like Harry Potter, what do they ultimately stand for behind the veneer of what they're presenting to the public. Something that we can apply not just to the Birdman, but also people we've critiqued before, such as Natalie Wynn, Bad Empanada. Natalie Wynn is a liberal Zionist. Bad Empanada is someone ostensibly on the left, ostensibly a radical leftist. I've clocked them as a Marxist-Leninist, specifically of a reactionary sort. Their treatment, not just of Natalie Wynn, but of me, has led me to write, going on a year ago now, Slurs Aren't Activism. This essay, Slurs Aren't Activism, was written to critique Natalie Wynn, aka Contrapoints for her liberal Zionism, a valid critique, but also ableist critics like Bad Empanada calling her narcissist, affecting myself and my friends, A, being trans and or mentally ill, including having various mental disorders. And this was my initial good faith approach when dealing with Bad Empanada, who, when I showed him the Black Mirror and pointed out, hey, when you're critiquing Natalie Wynn, you have valid things to say about them, but you're doing it in ways that are ultimately bigoted because you're upholding capital by punching down against trans people. You can critique Natalie Wynn for being trans and being a liberal Zionist, but the way that you're doing it, specifically calling them a narcissist, identity narcissism, the theater kid trope, even if Natalie Wynn is a theater kid and they're misusing those tools, slurs aren't activism. And you want to critique someone for their misuse of something, not for using it unto itself. So I'm a theater kid. I'm a gothicist, like Natalie Wynn, but I'm not a liberal Zionist. And if you want to know more about that, you can refer to my larger series on Zionism, vis-a-vis state vampirism, or the feeding through the state mid-abjection, be it openly capitalist or Marxist-Leninist. So in the case of Natalie Wynn, a centrist of a token white girl sort, a binary trans woman who is a liberal Zionist, they abject various critics in ways where they get quite hostile with them. But Bad Empanada, a Marxist-Leninist, is also guilty of the same things. And as we shall see in just a moment, the Birdman is also guilty of such things. I also want to point out before we start that holding a black mirror up in front of someone who's trying to say, actually, I'm not a bigot, is something that can be done by a variety of minorities. And it can be done not just by me, a white minority, specifically a white trans woman, but it can also be done by trans people in the black community who critique other black people, specifically Cat Black is critiquing Dave Chappelle, who's saying, actually, I'm not like those reactionaries who are using anti-trans language. And Cat Black holds up a black mirror, reversing abjection regarding what they're saying, where, similar to the Birdman responding to me and punching down against me for pointing out that they are a very particular kind of grifter, specifically a moderate centrist token grifter, Cat Black, a trans woman of color, is holding up the black mirror and showing Dave Chappelle and her own audience his hypocrisy. So he is continuing to deny and double down and try and further his own grifting narrative as a token moderate, pointing that out. So I love Cat Black. She is definitely worth acknowledging. So if you don't want to listen to me talk about this, you can watch someone like them, another trans person, a trans person of color, who holds people of color in their community accountable as an insider within that community who, all the same, being trans, is treated like an outsider, specifically in bad faith by Dave Chappelle, someone who is open about their transphobia, but insisting that there's a reasoned approach to it, that they can be more logical and comment on it in a way that isn't somehow reactionary or fascist. Ari, if you scratch a liberal, a fascist bleeds. And that's basically what Cat Black is doing here by holding up the mirror in front of Dave Chappelle. Also, before we proceed, the same idea of criticizing minorities doesn't just include racial minorities, but also, as I said earlier, when we were critiquing Bad Empanada, you can critique people who are ostensibly more politically radical who are white. So if you want an example of that, you can refer to not just my essay Slurs Aren't Activism, but also The Price of Rice in China, Our Capital in a Birdcage, where I go on to critique socialists who are white, but not from America. And they're talking about Chinese socialism. So it's not just a racial thing, RE with Cat Black, and it's not just a question of gender and culture tied to Americans, like Natalie Wynn, or Australians in the case of Bad Empanada, people from the West, but also in the case of Revolutionary Thought, someone who originally came from Russia, and they're talking about China. So there's a lot of application here insofar as reversing abjection goes, and it all ties to a larger series on state vampirism, which I will link in the description below. You can also apply the mirror to media. Oftentimes we don't realize that we're dealing with bad actors, and that can be more literal too. You know, it's on stage and off, but also in between through praxis is a liminal proposition, and that includes Frenchie, actor Tomer Capone, being in the IDF, where I say in response to the Cavernacles, IDF soldiers in Hollywood, that ruins the only thing I liked about The Boys. I honestly didn't know that Tomer Capone was in the IDF, and it's only surfacing recently through a translation of an interview that he gave to an Israeli outlet that he served in the IDF, and he was quite proud of that. I knew about Gal Gadot and how they were in the IDF, and I critique them quite a bit. And The Boys, even though it's a show that I've consumed, isn't something sacred to me. It's not a sacred cow. It's not something I'm just going to worship uncritically, just another show for me to boycott. Because if they have an actor in their production who's this bad faith, oh, don't believe what you hear, where they're doing the 1984 thing, and the party asked its members not to believe the evidence brought to their eyes and ears. It was the final, most essential command. Tomer Capone is essentially saying, oh, well, don't believe everything you hear. And they specifically say that in a social media post, if memory serves, where they have a picture of Albert Einstein, a Jewish man who was a socialist and who refused to be a member of Israel. Specifically, he turned down an offer to be the first Israeli prime minister, so that dubious honor went to David Ben-Gurion instead. So again, bad actors in that centrist kind of way, where in the case of The Boys, oh, Frenchie, he's just the whore with a heart of gold. There is a bit of lies and truth there, because the character in the show is someone who was a whore with a heart of gold, but also an assassin. And the show is basically displacing any critique of capital off onto a bad faith performance of someone who in real life conducts genocide. So everything that they present in the show, whatever positive things we could glean, are ultimately being delivered by a bad actor. Not so different than Kevin Spacey in House of Cards, a Shakespearean who delivered a pretty memorable performance in House of Cards, but then it came out that he was a pedophile. The moment that happens, boycotting media like that is perfectly fine, and furthermore, critiquing it. Boycotts and critiques are perfectly valid as far as that goes. Not just with Harry Potter, but also other franchise material as well, such as The Boys. The last thing I want to mention before we re-examine the Birdman is that by holding the Black Mirror, we are whistleblowers, and we are going to be treated as outliers, as mad women in the attic, as mad scientists in the case of Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, where an ecological disaster is predicated upon capital and consumption through capital. The profit motive through cheap, accessible food is a metaphor for climate change. It's a part of the larger process of capital moving money through nature to feed workers in ways that produce bigger and bigger hamburgers. It is destructive towards the planet. The metaphor in the case of Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs being that the more that people eat, the more they're left with nothing but these cheap disposable hamburgers that are bad for the environment. It literally just crowds the planet with this garbage food instead of a stable ecosystem. And in that story, the protagonist is forced to confront a side of themselves when they endorse initially this mad science in service to capital. And if it's one thing I've learned, it's that you can't run away from your own feet. We have to apply the mirror critically, not just to others, but to ourselves. Abjection goes both ways. But our enemies, moderates in this case, with the Birdman, will call us liars, and they will say that we're the bad actors. It's Darvo. Deny, accuser, reverse victim, offender, and obscurantism through the language of liberalism, specifically token liberalism in this case. So when you're dealing with people like that, they will treat you as mad, as someone to discredit, as someone who is a cartoon that you should point and laugh at. Liberals love to insult others, to use the language of reason to deliver bad faith arguments that, beneath the surface of however polite they sound, are actually Trojan horses furthering the abjection process. And how we need to respond to that is essentially the way that Jack Black's character in Anchorman does to Ron Burgundy's dog, Baxter. And before we watch this clip, I am fully aware that Jack Black, the person, is a giant centrist coward, someone who basically backpedals every chance they get, and they consume. So Jack Black, the person, isn't a good example of a whistleblower, but this scene here is a great example of reversing abjection.
What do you love?
I love poetry, and a glass of scotch, and of course, my friend Baxter here.
Well, guess what? Now this is happening.
Excuse me. Excuse me. What are you doing?
That's how I roll.
So imagine that being a conversation between me and the Birdman, where I take something that they love, that's sacred to them, through the abjection process, and I basically boot it off a bridge. And then I watch them respond in a way that reveals what they're hiding beneath the surface. In the case of the Birdman and I am showing them the ugly side, not just to Harry Potter, but also how they defend it, including punching down at iconoclasts such as myself. Ari, the scratching method. You scratch a liberal and you see how they cry. If they shed tears that are ultimately fascist, if they bleed blood, is it fascist? If they take revenge, what for? If they turn their back, what for? The idea is to expose bad actors. All of that being said, I now want to revisit something that I wrote through one of my responses to the Birdman after they showed their ass. So originally, this essay, Dead on Arrival, or Rowling's Autopsy and Those Who Shill Her, a semi-scripted follow-up to the Birdman's bigotry, didn't really focus on the Birdman, and to be entirely frank, still doesn't focus on them. This bibliography doubles as my script for a follow-up video to the Birdman's bigotry, Black Excellence, and Harry Potter fandom furthers transphobia. Its aim is less to focus on Birdman, tokenism, the monomyth, rainbow capitalism, or Black Snape, which the video essay covered already, and more to analyze Harry Potter, the character and the franchise fans' parallel stories, alongside J.K. Rowling's dubious declaration of different bigotries as Dead on Arrival inside a larger Gothic dialectic. So the original essay didn't really focus on the Birdman. Dead on Arrival only mentioned Birdman roughly at the start, but then the Birdman, having seen what I produced in regards to Harry Potter, decided to make it about them and to play the victim in ways that ultimately defend J.K. Rowling. Having scratched them, in other words, they shed fascist tears. If you scratch a liberal, a fascist bleeds, a fascist cries, a fascist plays victim, a fascist takes revenge. So that is something that I want to follow up on here. Despite the fact that we've done it already, I want to read my response to the Birdman, including a new section. A section that explains my thoughts and feelings as a former Harry Potter fan. So if you're going to walk away from Omelas, generally you're doing it from inside the city, from within capital, participating in society. We improve society. That can be Harry Potter or it can be anything else. The section that we're going to be reading from is Killing Your Darlings or Returning to Harry Potter as Dead, and a response from the Birdman and my words to him. These are the only two sections that we'll be reading, and as you can see, much of the rest of the bibliography, the essay body, the conclusion, doesn't talk about the Birdman, despite the fact that I am adding more about the Birdman to this essay. It doesn't really mention them because they are a smaller character and a larger story, ultimately critiquing Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling, and capitalism as something to defend by bad actors through a moderate veneer, hiding a reactionary core. First, Killing Your Darlings or Returning to Harry Potter as Dead. This essay pulls a Gothic classic, returning to home as dead or killing one's darlings by facing the dark side to them without rose-tinted glasses. In my case here, that means Harry Potter as a book series, which I read as a little girl in the 90s, specifically in middle school. The paradox of exposure is the value our first love gives while being bad for us, e.g. a queer person's exposure to The Wizard of Oz, Rocky Horror, and yes, Rowling's books or Tolkien's, etc. The idea here, as we proceed, is killing our darlings in ways that reverse abjection, ergo state predation, and capitalist realism. It being canonically easier to imagine a world that doesn't exist at all versus an end to Harry Potter is yet another simulacrum of Plato's allegory of the cave. We return to these things as dead, comparable to zombie Simpsons, and parody them however we wish, not sabotage but transformation, rallying up our enemies who abject us through the franchise they police. Source, Straight Dog Water or Saving Alien Earth, from a Freudian snob. Rob Ager shows full ass, reviewing show he hasn't fully watched. This takes moxie. In Dead on Arrival, I pull no punches, i.e. killing our darlings with our darlings, e.g. C.S. Lewis, whose quote about Tolkien remains germane here, when using Tolkien to hoist Rowling and the Birdman on their petards. Here are beauties which pierce like swords or burn like cold iron. Here is a book that will break your heart. As a little girl, I read Harry Potter to my family, specifically to my mother and grandmother in my living room, who sold these books at bookstores before the internet as we know it existed, a cultural movement not unlike Star Wars or before that, Beatlemania. They are precious to me, not unlike the One Ring, except I went on to Tom Bombadil them, to put aside childish things, yet return to and take to task more than Bombadil himself did, causing everyone in that book a giant headache. This is not unusual, and Harry Potter is, for many of all ages, a special point in their lives, i.e. a half-real place to gothically revive and return to Misa Numbime, specifically their childhood, as a moment of rebellion that goes on to later eclipse itself, comparable to Dumbledore eventually betraying Harry's trust, which we'll get into. E.g. my best friend Ginger, also trans, growing up in a Christian fundamentalist household and reading Harry Potter to be rebellious in adulthood, doing so because these books were described to them by their parents literally as witchcraft. To that, the duality and turmoil of such interrogations is one that remains idiosyncratic between different readers, me reading the books when I was small, alongside the Birdman and Ginger at different points in their lives, and each of us having different responses to the literature, i.e. as outliving the legacy of the author, acting the fool. In this case, Ginger and I, being trans, found it easier to reject the series than Birdman has, or hasn't, in his case, because of what it means socially and materially to us, versus Birdman continuing to punch down. In short, he was unwilling to kill his darlings, in his case, when trans genocide and other hate campaigns are actively ongoing, and me telling it to his face, and him gaslighting me when calling him out. Gothic maturity is the ability to discuss taboo things in non-harmful, beneficial ways, i.e. Ginger and I are gothically mature, and Birdman and Rowling's series are not. Furthermore, Ginger and I can actually have a conversation about Rowling's bullshit, whereas Birdman is standoffishly obtuse, what Ginger describes as touching a stove or wrestling a pig. There's value in friendship, specifically friendships where the interlocutors know each other well and are familiar with the arguments the other might make about this or that, including but not limited to books. Ginger is one such person, my best and closest friend, who I can talk to knowing they're a good actor, who understands me sometimes better than I do myself. We challenge and motivate each other to change. So if books are an extension of our lives, then Ginger has helped me shape my life and my books in ways difficult to quantify but worth honoring. Friends and their artifacts shape who we are, mis en mime. Artist Persephone Vanderwaard of Ginger, originally illustrated to celebrate their coming out as trans, but revised in a more devilish form for this book. Source Acknowledgements, 2024. The same goes for our enemies, who often have more in common with us than the rulers they sell out to. Birdman, by comparison, is unable to even have a conversation at all. In short, and telling me as a recipient of genocide in so many words that it's all in my head. They are a false friend, the very kind of fake who is silent in times of crisis that MLK warned about, re, we will remember not the voices of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. To that, Birdman is silent where it counts, and punches down loudly to defend capital, which Rowling and Harry Potter are, i.e. it is easier for him to imagine my friends and I disappearing than it is Harry Potter. Talking to him is like pulling teeth then, and I'm the dentist. All of that being said, I'm not arguing for censorship of Harry Potter, far from it. Instead, vis-a-vis Milton's Areopagitica, I'm arguing for a boycott of the books as to not fund Rowling's genocide. Allegory and sedition concern private consumption of things not endorsed in public. So if these books, despite having mostly outstayed their welcome, and for me, at least, largely being relegated to positions of academic critique owing to their cultural significance, have special significance to you, and you want to, can enjoy them in safely private ways without contributing to trans hate crimes and state violence, knock yourselves the fuck out. In other words, don't be a Nazi or a token Nazi in Birdman's case, and we're golden babes. And when I say Nazi, of course, in my opinion, they are a moderate, a centrist. Re, if you scratch a liberal, a centrist bleeds, a centrist cries. A fascist bleeds, cries, seeks revenge. We've already read this essay portion before, a response from the Birdman and my words to him, and I imagine there are some small changes that I've included to it, but by and large, I have already recorded myself reading this. I will put it here in this video at the end. It will be simply the same footage inserted into this video as an afterthought, as something to just kind of include within my larger critique of the Birdman at this point in time. As I do, keep in mind that various instances of critiquing the status quo of media for the state in some shape or form, on and off stage, in and out of fiction, tied to fantasy and so-called real life, which sits between the stage and the crowd in a kayfabe kind of way, incorporates elements of class, culture, and race. So there are other people who have things to say about these issues besides myself, e.g. John the Duncan's Universalism and the Anti-Woke, which I cited in my own book series, Operational Difficulties and Revolutionary Cryptonomy in particular, where they mention Universalism and the Anti-Woke vis-a-vis the struggles of soldiers of color during and after World War II, for instance, an ongoing thing. So anything that I talk about here, you can apply the same basic ideas of reversing abjection to out bad actors tied to issues of class, culture, and race, awareness, and solidarity as things to raise in the face of bad actors. All of that attaches to a lot of different historical moments in time, in and out of stories. Stories that can be fictional and non-fictional to varying degrees. John the Duncan is a doctor themselves. I have an independent PhD, but they have a PhD from an actual academic institution. So whereas my research is largely independent and built off my master's, which I did get at an actual university, they are, for lack of a better term, the real deal, and they study neoliberalism in the world at large and its effect on the world at large through popular stories. for instance, they do a Foucauldian analysis of Chicken Run. So definitely worth looking into. Also, John the Duncan has, said publicly in their videos on social media, what have you, that they are queer. So there's a queer character to them, which you could possibly glean through a Foucauldian analysis of Chicken Run, but also Foucault is such a famous academic that doesn't necessarily mean someone is queer if they cite Foucault in a specific reading of something, but in this case, the shoe definitely fits, and John the Duncan's work is work that I've cited many times, definitely worth looking into, so check it out if you're not just interested in what I have to say. And furthermore, check out the works of the other people that I recommend in this video, not just Cat Black, not just John the Duncan, and not just myself, or even the Birdman for that matter, but also refer to different things shared to me by my partner Bay Ryan, a Mali-Irish disabled neurodivergent person who, being trans themselves, and being the editor and co-writer of my book series, 7 books in total at this point, re my latest book was just released yesterday, basically, and I've updated all of my book volumes so that they are all nice and happy and polished and ready for you to insert them into your bodies. Bay Ryan has shown me a lot of the things that I discuss in terms of racism, in terms of Indigenous struggles, intersecting with struggles of minorities more broadly in ways that have to intersect. E.g., my video, Intersecting Discourse, inviting 2 different Muslims to discuss trans Indigenous rights, where I invite Lady Istihar and Yusuf Abdul Hussein to talk about the intersection of trans Indigenous rights that were tied to issues forwarded to me by my partner, Bay Ryan. So that's the importance of having these kinds of discussions. You don't want someone like the Birdman who's going to be like, oh, I'm not a grifter, I'm right, you're wrong, who's just going to bury their head in the sand while Rome is burning around them. They're basically Black Nero fiddling, and if they won't pull their head out of their ass voluntarily, then we can at the very least turn what they're doing, showing us their ass, and turn that into an object lesson. And whether or not they actually come around isn't really the point. They are doing what they're doing, and we are going to carry on doing what we're doing. They further abjection, we reverse it. Source, YouTube comments, essay number 10, Dead on Arrival, or J.K. Rowling's Autopsy and Those Who Shill Her. My latest essay appears to have struck a nerve. The Birdman, stop tagging me in this bullshit. Me. Please, it's not to get your attention, but to show people your channel, a point and click. But if being tagged in an essay reporting on your behavior bothers you, change your behavior. Calling my work bullshit only exposes you as reactionary beneath the surface, i.e., if you scratch a moderate, a conservative bleeds. The go-to approach of a fascist, or fascist light, fascist with more masks, being to play the Darvo card, a huge red flag, all on its own. To that, I'm frankly not in the mood for games, or being tone policed by someone who really should know better. Kindly stop shilling J.K. Rowling's work in 2026. Doing so isn't just transphobic, ambiphobic, and intermissic, but cisqueerphobic, e.g. homophobic, biphobic, etc., racist, sexist, ableist, anti-Indigenous, culturally appropriative, and many other things besides. In other words, stop grifting for the moderate, from the moderate token side of the coin, re calling my work bullshit, when only one of us, not you, is actually challenging fascism, by neither shilling J.K. Rowling's book series, nor accusing critics of Rowling as asking for their pound of flesh, an anti-Semitic trope, but also anti-activist sentiment, one targeting queer people in this case for using the same blood libel language that has, when used, similar deleterious effects, i.e. fascism is bad for minorities, and to shill Rowling defends fascism. While you're at it, make a video apologizing and explaining why it's wrong to shill Rowling's work in 2026. See above. I don't like reactionaries, but I like moderates even less because they're giant hypocrites who undermine the integrity of social justice. Back in the 1960s, MLK described this as the white moderate, but the same basic logic ties to token moderates, too, i.e. black excellence / capitalism and race traders, in your case, getting that bag on the backs of different minorities exploited by fascists, i.e., many trans victims aren't white, male, American, or even from the global north. In other words, do better. Such dismissals are par for the course when it comes to moderates, and in Birdman's case, illustrate a telltale inability to respond to valid criticism with anything other than self-righteous anger and apathy. Source: YouTube community post, Persephone Vanderwoord, 4/14/2026. He then responds, "I don't care. Do not tag me again. I'm not reading this bullshit. You're barking up the wrong tree. You are wrong. Don't tag me again." Me, I don't need to. You've already shown me your ass. Edit. Apparently, you can't read 3 paragraphs, let alone a single sentence. I kindly stop shilling J.K. Rowling's work in 2026. Gotta love someone who claps their hands over their ears while shouting, "I'm not wrong," during a genocide caused by the person whose work they're shilling, then making veiled threats to a recipient of said genocide. Don't tag me again. Weird behavior, dude. Source: YouTube community post, Persephone Vanderwoord, 4/14/2026. Such a thing had not happened since first he came to the mountain. His rage past description, the sort of rage that is only seen when rich folk that have more than they can enjoy suddenly lose something that they have long had, but have never before used or wanted, writes Tolkien in The Hobbit. He continues through Bilbo, "Never laugh at live dragons." But we must, I argue, already having studied dragons extensively as metaphors for greed, re dragon sickness, the problem of greed. For not only is the Birdman a dragon, but a self-righteous one, i.e. Gandalf with the One Ring, a threat despite appearing good. Gandalf as Ring Lord would have been far worse than Sauron. He would have remained righteous, but self-righteous. He would have continued to rule and order things for good, and the benefit of his subjects according to his wisdom, which was, and would have remained, great. The draft ends here, and the margin Tolkien wrote, "Thus while Sauron multiplied a legible word, evil, he left good clearly distinguishable from it. Gandalf would have made good detestable and seem evil." Source: Letter 246 from a letter to Miss Eileen Elgar, Drafts, in Humphrey Carpenter's The Letters of J.R.R. Tolkien. Dragons are dualistic symbols, of course. You must anisotropically level moderate and reactionary ones with our own analysis, i.e. lest the greed they abjectly symbolize continue infecting the land and its peoples through many different vectors, as Tolkien's inside-outside Tolkien's world continue to do. Ari, my larger body of scholarship on Tolkien, including his racism. Image source: Daniel Udell's The Hobbit, Book to Film Analysis, Part 11. I want to conclude with a lesson and provide an Indigenous perspective to show that African Americans, male or otherwise, don't monopolize oppression. That Birdman strikes me as very close-minded, but also someone who thinks themselves wise, i.e. as having a monopoly on oppression and popular media, but nonetheless deaf to allegory and as thin-skinned as Rowling herself, acting like a white man in either case. A clue to addressing that lies in Indigenous cultures, e.g. the Maori. Maori, my partner Vey explains, who is non-binary and Maori Irish themselves, believes in laughter and questioning traditions through tikanga and myths. To that, tikanga is rooted in the concept of tika, which means right or correct. Tikanga serves as a guiding framework for culturally appropriate behavior, promoting respect and understanding within social interactions. These customs are deeply connected to Maori origin stories and their relationship with the land, encompassing principles of guardianship over the earth. Source: Josephine Campbell's Tikanga Maori. Or as Bay taught me, assimilation is poor stewardship, offering more meat to the concept's bones than the other author does, i.e. with a more localized and non-white description. Tikanga covers a wide range of areas, for example, values, culture, protocols, customs, ethics, etiquette, sustainability, and law. It supports mana atua, spiritual, mana whenua, connection to the land, mana tupauna, ancestry and Tangada people. We are aware that tikanga is a concept that is fluid and dynamic. We are also aware that one journal entry does not sufficiently address the true entirety of tikanga, as it is an expression of a Maori worldview that encompasses a way of thinking, something that can never really be communicated, only lived. Having said this, we think it is important to discuss an approach that brings about balance in nature and among people in the face of environmental change and resource depletion, source Atawa health, or what Tolkien would describe as desolation. The point here is that much of this is rooted in debate, or the working out of unfixed things through poetry and stories. In Gothic, by facing and overcoming alienation in ways that African Americans are, themselves, not exempt from, nor the sole arbiters of through pulp media, through what I reduce to gossip, monsters, and camp. Mythology-wise, we'll go with Maui, from a conversation Bay and I had while discussing Birdman and how borked his behavior was, e.g. as shown in Disney's Moana 2016 below. Source Fandom. During our talk, Bay explained to me how Maui was a demigod. Source EBSCO, with one foot in both worlds, a trickster shapeshifter similar to Loki or Satan, giving him a hubristic, tragic, but also trans characteristics. See J.G. Harker's Loki, Gender and Sexuality in Norse Society. Who stole fire from the gods, specifically Mahuika and To Te Ahi A Mahuika, or the stealing of the fire narrative. See Encyclopedia Mythica, similar to Prometheus from Greek myth, but also in my case, Persephone betrothed to Hades. In trying to conquer death and join the rift between humanity and the gods, symbols of alienation, immortality, and nature as numinous, Maui pays the ultimate price. Finally, Maui decides to overcome his ancestress Hine Nue Te Po, goddess of thunder. Full of confidence and Faustian curiosity, a somewhat greedy thirst for knowledge centered around deception, Maui gathers a flock of island birds as companions. Together they come to the place where Hine is sleeping. Maui plans to enter Hine, crawl through her body, and pass out through her mouth. This will kill her and ensure Maui's immortality after seemingly disemboweling her. However, Maui's plan will succeed only if none of the birds laugh at him in the process, shown below. Unfortunately for Maui, one of the birds cannot help but laugh once Maui is inside Hine. In consequence, the old woman awakens, and she opens her eyes, starts up, and kills Maui. Maui's surprise death means that all humans have become mortal. Humans will bear children, but all will have to die eventually. Source EBSCO. In this case, it's quite similar not just to the Promethean theft of the god's fire, but also the Medusa's story, somewhat, though I think Hine crushes Maui's head between her thighs versus a petrifying gaze. i.e., nature is monstrous feminine and classically female, or having female elements tied to life and death, a source of terror guarding something sacred, alien and mighty, dark, intense, etc. Gorgons aside, such stories teach us morals about nature as abject, i.e. in ways we can reclaim, rejoin through the exchange of forbidden knowledge, i.e. the Promethean quest and Faustian bargain, two Gothic staples. Here, I'm applying this to dragons as things to steal fire from, or gold in Tolkien's case. Thus I remind those not above reproach how they need to be criticized like anyone, R.E. Birdman acting like a know-it-all, yet alienated from things that others know more about than he apparently does, e.g. me and Tolkien, but I digress. I'm also kissed by fire myself, a rape survivor, granddaughter to a Holocaust survivor, and a trans woman bullied by a variety of peoples tied to popular media, video games in my case, but also heavy metal. The point in saying so isn't to rank rape or indulge in oppression Olympics, but establish deeper connections to nature and ourselves, i.e. as of nature, what Patel and Moore describe as thinking beings versus extended beings under Cartesian dualism, e.g. connecting through to food, sex, war, technology, and yes, death as bound up in the land and vice versa under capital. To that, Birdman doesn't want any of this because he knows I'm right, and all he can do is act tough/righteous. whatever he does, I feel vindicated, i.e. if we scratch a token, a fascist bleeds. But we'll get to that. By playing with fire, with dragons, with witches, and so on. Artist Gottfried Lindauer. Fire in this case is knowledge tied to creation, with Mahuika and evocations to fire-making above, similar to Athena, mother goddess of wisdom. Ari Creed. And not something strictly monopolized by Cartesian arbiters playing God for the ruling class, i.e. tikanga, as practices that keep Mali alive and have through their colonization, which apply just as well to transfolk delivering a comeuppance versus those token parties who, portraying out of desperation and convenience, sell us down the river, and whose transphobia among cis BIPOC we'll explore deeper in. Knowledge, like all power, is flexible, something to make into a weapon if need be, and levied against prideful traitors having turned into dragons for the state, something to slay with what can't be monopolized, taking our fire away from those who abuse it, the fire from the dragon's belly. Arrow, black arrow, I have saved you to the last. You have never failed me, and I have always recovered you. I had you from my father, and he from of old, if ever you came from the forges of the true king under the mountain. Go now and speed well. Fight fire with fire, babes. All of that being said, this was my response to the Birdman, continuing to play the victim, continuing to say that he's not a grifter, continuing to cope, basically. He is coping pretty hard right now, and he doesn't want to respond to me in any kind of way that furthers the conversation. He's just doubling down. So I hope that you found that useful. I hope that you find all the resources that I provided useful, and that you yourself are able to see through the illusions that he tries to spin for you. Someone in his own video said, "Yeah, I still love the sound of your voice," which made me think, well, a lot of people like the voice of Saruman too. Beware his voice. He will cast a spell over you. And the Birdman is a very particular kind of grifter. Again, a centrist, a token moderate for all intents and purposes. And we have to unmask them like any gothic villain. So hopefully this video has given you, at the very least, rich food for thought, and you are able to think more critically, not just about the Birdman, but about Harry Potter and popular media in the world at large when reversing abjection yourselves. If you like the work that I do, you can like, share, and subscribe, leave a comment, what have you. The Birdman did, and he wound up being in one of my essays. So if you do the same thing, who knows, maybe I'll talk about you too. Hopefully in a more positive way, but regardless, I will do something constructive with you. Until next time, thank you for watching, and take care.